G'day, it's Nicky and welcome to Wicked Wildlife. Now, if you've been watching our videos lately, you'd probably be aware that recently we got the chance to go up to the top end of Australia, up to Darwin. And one of the highlights of that trip was getting to see the world famous Adelaide River and check out the jumping crocodile cruises. Now, feeding wildlife out in the wild is a pretty controversial topic. So I thought today we'd do a video on the pros and cons about feeding these specific crocodiles on the Adelaide River. So stick around, guys, it should be a pretty interesting topic. Pretty dangerous. For wicked wildlife encounters, this is totally our residence from a good member to our wild family here. In Australia, have a look. We've got two different undertakes, but I hope you have a great one and take care. So, as a general rule of thumb, most people can agree that feeding wild animals out in the wild is not a great thing to do. As the saying goes, fed wildlife is dead wildlife. Recently, down in my area in Western Victoria, a sea lion was actually put to sleep after it had learnt to start chasing and harassing fishermen for fish scraps. But the case of the Adelaide River might be a unique exception. Recently, we had the chance, as I said, to go down and check out one of these cruises. And there's a bunch of different places that actually do it. The group that we decided to stick with was the original Adelaide River cruise. And we hopped on their bigger boat, the Adelaide River Queen. A couple of the major concerns that a lot of people have about feeding animals in the wild is the first one is, are we making animals dependent on these handouts? And this happens in suburbia. People feeding things like the magpies and the birds that come in, and they can learn to stop going and hunting for their own food. Now, the case of the Adelaide River is very tightly controlled. There's only a handful of people who have permits to do it, and they only run during the dry season. Now what this basically means is during the wet season, where crocodiles are actually using most of their food, they need to catch more food when they're more active during the wet season or the summer months, there's no cruises. So these guys don't have the ability to become dependent on these handouts. They've got no choice but to go and get something else. They also make sure that they only feed very small quantities of food per tour. Each crocodile gets a very small piece for a couple of jumps, so as not to create a situation where the crocodiles can afford to stop finding their own food. The second major reason that some people might be against feeding these crocodiles off these tour boats is that there is a belief amongst some people that it's going to make the crocodiles more dangerous. And it sounds pretty feasible when you first think about it. Their opinion is that by putting food off these boats, we're going to be training crocodiles to then follow other boats in turn. This hypothesis was actually tested. In the 1990s, Charles Darwin University put out a paper on, do the crocodile feeding cruises on the Adelaide River cause any detectable behavioural difference? They observed something like 40 crocodiles or so and their behaviours before feeding and after feeding, and observed crocodiles on the stretch of river where they're fed and outside the stretch of river at what they're fed. And what they found is it made virtually no detectable difference in crocodilian behaviour from one boat to another boat. So it didn't really make them a more dangerous animal. The reason why we can say this is that while it's true that animals can learn to associate human beings with food, such as bears going through a trash can at a campsite somewhere in the United States, crocodilians have a very specific way of analysing things. A great example is when I used to work in wildlife parks with crocodiles. We had some of our crocodiles that learnt the difference with a white bucket, which we used for cleaning enclosures with, and a silver bucket, which we fed them with. The crocodile would see the silver bucket, he'd go wild. He'd see a white bucket, and he'd learn it's not worth his energy. And the boats that they use for these tours are not the same boats that people are fishing out of. These are large vessels with twin motors that look and sound and put out a different vibration to the other boats on the river. So they are getting a cue to follow a boat. They hear this boat and they pop up, but they're getting a cue to follow a very specific boat. If there is a danger of crocodiles becoming habituated to following boats, it's probably not from the crocodile cruises themselves. As we said, the crocodiles learn that that specific boat is the boat that feeds them. And for 100 years or so, they were shot out of little fishing boats. They didn't approach them. But what can possibly happen is if other people, members of the public fishing or people running fishing charters on the same stretch of river, decide to make an extra few bucks or keep their clients happy by feeding the crocodiles off the back of their boats. When people start feeding them off of tinnies and things, crocodiles are going to learn that maybe the little fishing boats have food as well. So when it's done properly, we know it's safe. In fact, in 35 years of doing crocodile feeding cruises, the area has been pretty much without incident. When you bear all these things in mind, that the area has an impeccable safety record, that the people who are allowed to feed these crocodiles are very tightly controlled, not only in where they're allowed to do it, but how they're allowed to do it, what vessels they're allowed to do it with, there's lots and lots of regulations. The general public are not allowed to feed these crocodiles, and for good reason. But when the rules are followed, so far, it's got an incredible safety record. On top of that, there's another big benefit that people don't really think about. The group that we went on, which is a brilliant tour, the guys really knew their stuff, they had all sorts of cool crocodile facts, but they do 3 or 4 tours a day. They would have tens of thousands of people a year come through and do their tours, and those people are all not only getting a chance to see crocodiles in the wild, but a big part of the tour is crocodile safety and just some good information, biology about crocodiles. All of these people, whether they like it or not, are going to learn something about crocodiles, and if only 1% of them actually go out and take that information on board, they share that knowledge with a friend, or maybe they remember how to be croc safe when they're out in the wild by themselves, that's making a difference. So when you consider the impeccable safety record of these crocodile feeding cruises and the potential outreach that it has, it's an amazing platform for education. The best way to get people passionate about wildlife is to get people out there amongst wildlife. And if this is the way to do it, so be it. I think it was brilliant. As well as the outreach and education potential that these tours offer people to learn about crocodiles, the last big benefit is it makes wild crocodiles worth money. All of these cruises along the Adelaide River, and there's several companies, they all employ local people who are making a living out of crocodiles being in the wild. Those people, whether or not they're real conservationists, are going to be passionate about making sure that that stretch of river is left healthy and has a good population of crocodiles. We're making the ecosystem valuable to maintain, and that is the best way to ensure that this environment is left for future generations to enjoy. So at the end of the day, all things considered, when you look at the impeccable safety record that these tours have, the educational outreach, and the fact that it makes these wild crocodiles a valuable asset to keep and maintain and care for, I think it's a no-brainer. This particular example of feeding these crocodiles is a good thing for the area, for crocodiles, and for conservation as a whole. Now, this isn't to say that feeding wildlife as a general rule of thumb is a good idea. This is not the same as feeding the magpies or kookaburras in your backyard or attracting the cockies to the local park. But this example, when done right, is a great example of how human beings and wild animals can interact potentially to the benefit of both. Now, the last thing I'd like to say is there is a bunch of these tour groups that do it, and I didn't get the chance to check them all out. But the group that we tagged along with, the original Adelaide River Crocodile Cruises, was impeccable. The guys really knew their stuff. They made sure they hammered home proper facts, crocodile safety. They didn't exaggerate and they didn't interfere with the animals any more than really necessary. They're a great group and I'd highly recommend you check them out. I'll leave a link in the description of our video to their Facebook page and their YouTube channel. And to finish things off, if you enjoyed our video, please leave a comment or like or subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already. Check us out on Facebook if that's where you watch us. And the last thing, if you want to help us get up to places like the Northern Territory again, or Queensland, or anywhere else in Australia, to bring you the best wildlife experiences and the coolest wildlife facts, there is a big thing you can do. You can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/wickedwildlife, where your contributions will help us get further afield, visit more animals, and make better videos. Other than that, guys, as always, thanks for watching. Be nice to wildlife. Get out there and enjoy it. See you next week.